Trudeau, à propos des Olympiques, M. Biden parle de boycott diplomatique. Est-ce que le Canada est prêt à suivre le même exemple que les Américains?
Ça fait des mois qu'on en parle avec nos partenaires à l'international de quelle devrait être notre posture par rapport aux Olympiques. On en a beaucoup parlé au G7 même à Cornwall. Les États-Unis ont fait leur annonce, mais nous sommes en train de regarder comment s'aligner avec le plus grand nombre de partenaires possible. On va avoir une annonce à faire.
Concernant l'Ukraine, le ministre de la Défense de l'Ukraine demande au Canada d'envoyer davantage de troupes à la frontière. Vous leur répondez quoi?
J'ai parlé justement au président de l'Ukraine la semaine passée pour souligner à quel point le Canada est là pour appuyer l'Ukraine comme on l'est depuis des années. On est amis, on est très préoccupés par les troupes russes aux frontières. On est en train de travailler avec nos partenaires de l'OTAN et nos partenaires européens et américains pour signaler aux Russes que ce serait inacceptable qu'ils lancent une campagne contre l'Ukraine. Les Canadiens qui sont en Ukraine maintenant sont là à titre de pour faire de la formation, ils sont pas là pour faire du combat et ça ne changera pas. We've been talking about our collective posture in regards to the Olympics for many, many months amongst friends and allies. We had long conversations about it at the G7 back in Cornwall. We believe, and Canada has always believed, that working in alignment with our best partners and allies around the world is the best way to get things done. That's certainly what was most effective in regards to getting home the two Michaels. We will continue to work with our allies, and I'm sure there'll be announcements to be made in the coming weeks.
Les conditions dans des hôtels, qu'est-ce que vous dites aux Canadiens? Apparemment, le collègue du groupe nous apprenait qu'il y a bien des gens qui se plaignent qui n'ont pas de couches, qui n'ont pas de buanderie, qui n'ont rien.
J'ai été informé effectivement qu'il y avait des conditions totalement inacceptables dans certains endroits là, où on accueille les gens qui viennent entre autres de pays qu'on a identifiés. Alors j'ai demandé à la santé publique de faire le travail qu'elle doit faire, c'est-à-dire de s'assurer que les normes sont atteintes par les fournisseurs de services. Ce sont des fournisseurs là, auxquels on a délégué la responsabilité de prendre soin des gens. On sait que c'est très difficile pour tout le monde, on est en période de grande incertitude, mais il faut quand même prendre soin correctement des gens qui sont hébergés là, dans les installations de quarantaine.
Mais est-ce que nous dire aujourd'hui à quel moment tout le monde va être testé systématiquement? Avez-vous une date?
Bien, ça avance rapidement. J'ai hâte de faire le point avec vous prochainement. J'ai encore eu des nouvelles ce matin. Alors, on sait que la semaine dernière, la capacité a augmenté de 60 et on me dit que dans les derniers jours, ça continue à augmenter. Donc, ça va bien, mais on a encore du chemin à faire avant que toutes les normes et toutes les attentes soient identiques à travers tous les aéroports du pays.
Minister Duclos, on the third country testing rule from South Africa, Canada has been widely criticized by international experts, by the WHO, for requiring people to leave South Africa, go to, for example, Ethiopia, which is a war-torn country, to get a third test. What is the rationale for not accepting a test from within South Africa?
There are two aspects to your question. First, the transportation question, the third country arrival test, and then the health rationale. Now, the health rationale is a rationale that has been assessed and exposed by the Public Health Agency of Canada, the experts. And as you heard Dr. Tam explain just last week, that assessment was made on the basis of both the local epidemiology, obviously, but also in some cases the connection between what is reported domestically in terms of the variant and what is exported or imported into Canada in terms of the variant cases. So it all depends on specific countries, but overall the public health experts have advised that we should focus on these 10 countries. Now, on the transportation aspect of your question, I think Minister Alghabra and Minister Mendicino indicated yesterday that they have allowed exemptions to be put into place to make sure that in cases of extreme circumstances, and we see how difficult that can be for Canadians, for instance, to come back from some of these countries, appropriate adjustments are allowed.
But I'm confused how you're describing the need for the third country testing. It seems to be saying that you don't trust the labs in South Africa to provide an adequate test. Why else would you not accept a test from South Africa at the same time that we do accept that South Africa is the one that first identified this variant? So their labs are good enough to identify variants but not good enough to identify COVID?
Well, this is all based on public health expertise, and I would suggest that in addition to the fact that we need to have in the current emergency context, unusual and strict conditions, we also need to be mindful that these tests are imperfect. Not all tests detect both the COVID-19 and the new variant, and also because of the time it takes for people to be sufficiently viral charged for those tests to be effective. And these are long journeys, so we believe, at least that's what their public health officials have said, we believe that this third country test measure, however difficult it may be for some to follow it, is necessary in the current context.
Monsieur Valentino, les hôtels de quarantaine, qu'est-ce qui se passe? Ça fait 2 fois là, encore des problèmes cette fois-ci, des couches qui ne sont pas offertes aux bébés, on parle de la nourriture qui pourrait être périmée. Qu'est-ce qui se passe? On fait quoi avec ce modèle-là?
Mais premièrement, toutes les mesures que nous avons introduites à la frontière est là pour la protection et la santé des Canadiens et des Canadiennes. C'est une approche qui est informée par le conseil de nos fonctionnaires dans le secteur public santé. Et on va continuer d'offrir des conseils à tous les Canadiens clairement. Donc, ils peuvent suivre les mesures pour leur protection.
Mais les hôtels, est-ce qu'on répare le modèle ou on en trouve une autre solution? Parce que ça ne semble pas fonctionner encore.
Écoute, on va travailler ensemble avec une équipe dans le gouvernement pour nous assurer qu'il y a un système avec beaucoup d'efficace, même dans les conditions de la quarantaine. Et je sais qu'il y a quelques enjeux. Il faut adresser cet enjeu pour les voyageurs. Mais en même temps, je veux souligner pour tous les Canadiens et les Canadiennes que les mesures sont là pour leur protection. Merci beaucoup.
Have you read some of the stories? Mr. President, anything you want to do with the quarantine hotel, with the report from the Globe about the conditioning there?
Look,
have you seen the article?
these measures are put in place to protect the health and safety of travelers and Canadians. Any individual cases where necessary care or service was not done, we will look into it, because we want to make sure that every traveler gets the care and the service that they deserve. Thanks.
J'aimerais ça vous parler des frontières et de la confusion. La confusion là, avec les voyageurs, c'est la faute des voyageurs ou c'est la faute du gouvernement?
Bien, en ce moment, il y a tellement de confusion, les informations sont tellement variées, il n'y a tellement pas d'instructions claires qui sont données qu'on comprend les voyageurs d'être mélangés. Une chatte, ils ne retrouveraient pas ces petits. Parce que le gouvernement n'a pas de plan de match. On dirait que les douaniers ne sont pas au courant de ce que dit le ministre de la Sécurité publique. Et puis, les informations changent selon le pays dans lequel vous êtes, le continent sur lequel vous êtes. Des vols qui sont interdits. Des fois, il faut des tests. Des fois, il faut des tests de là-bas. Des fois, il faut venir ici puis rester 14 jours dans un hôtel. Je comprends les gens d'être tous mélangés. Le gouvernement est tout mélangé.
On parle d'arrive-camp, par exemple. Traverser aux États-Unis, passer 1 heure là-bas, revenir, ne pas avoir téléchargé l'application. C'est la faute du voyageur, c'est pas la faute du gouvernement, là.
Mais il faut que le voyageur, ils doivent le savoir, qu'ils ont besoin de ça avant de partir. Ou s'il en a plus besoin, comme a dit le ministre de la Sécurité publique, bien dans ce cas-là, il faut que le douanier soit au courant, lui, que le voyageur n'a pas besoin de l'application. Mais là, en ce moment, tout le monde est mélangé.
Les hôtels, comment vous trouvez ça? On apprend aujourd'hui que ça va pas dans les hôtels, il y a toutes sortes de cas où les gens n'ont pas de couche, pas de service de buanderie, par exemple.
Mais ça fait dur, c'est ordinaire. T'sais, comme dirait ma mère, là, dans la vie, des fois, il y a des minimums. Puis, avoir de la nourriture qui n'est pas avariée, avoir la possibilité de laver son linge, avoir des droits à certains services. Ces gens-là font un effort pour la santé publique. Hein, il faut être confinés, mais que le gouvernement donne un minimum de services. Puis en ce moment, on est en dessous de la table. Là.
On fait quoi devant ça? Un terme à quarantaine à l'hôtel?
Non. Ça serait pas responsable de mettre un terme à la quarantaine. La bonne chose à faire, c'est de donner des services adéquats à ces citoyens et ces citoyennes-là. Ils ont droit. Ils participent à un effort collectif. La moindre des choses, c'est de les traiter de manière digne.
Êtes-vous surpris de ça? Dans la mesure où c'est pas la première fois?
Oui, on est surpris de ça, parce qu'on aurait dû apprendre du passé. Ça fait quasiment 2 ans qu'on est dans cette situation-là. C'est pas la première fois qu'il y a des confinements, c'est pas la première fois qu'il y a des gens qui sont envoyés dans un hôtel. Donc, on le sait, c'est quoi la liste de choses à faire, comment ça se fait qu'ils n'ont pas fait le check sur tous les points.
Mr. Bullers, I have 2 questions for you. The first one is on the fact that Canada appears to be one of the only countries, certainly among our peers like the U.S. and the U.K., to require Canadians to go to Ethiopia, for example, for a test to leave South Africa, go to a war-torn country, get a test in order to come back to Canada. Do you think that rule makes sense? Should that rule continue?
What we are asking the Liberal government is some consistency and some clarity with traveling people who travel around the world. Some people are stuck in certain countries. Their flights that are being cancelled. They cannot, come in Canada. If you're from some certain African country, it's the case. If you're in Europe, it's not the case. The test and it's confusing. So we ask to propose a plan, to table a plan that will be clear for everybody what you should do and how, and when the federal government is there to help you to come back in Canada safely. Maybe it's a good example of things that should be done for the safety of collective safety here in Canada and health safety. But right now, nothing is clear. That's the problem.
And on the government's website, we've heard for the last week the government say the new rules are already in place for on-arrival testing and isolation, that it's a slow ramp-up, they're being rolled out slowly depending on the airport. Now the government's website says the new rules are, quote, coming soon.
So I think it's adding to the confusion we are talking about right now. So because some announcements were made by the Transport Minister last week, other exception with South Africa Saturday, and now the rules are coming and the plan is coming. So of course everybody is confused, and they should do better and they should have known better, because it's not like the pandemic is there since 3 weeks. It's been there for almost 2 years. So they're supposed to be in charge, and really not proud of my federal government right now.
Avoir des vols pour rapatrier les Canadiens qui sont pris dans certains pays. On n'a plus de vols, ils sont pas capables de sortir du pays parce que d'autres vols ont été annulés ailleurs. On devrait analyser comme en début de pandémie les vols pour rapatrier les Canadiens.
L'important, c'est d'offrir le service aux Canadiens puis aux Canadiennes qui sont coincés puis qui sont pris à l'étranger. Bon, déjà, c'est un petit peu mélangeant qu'il y a des pays dont les vols directs sont interdits. Il y a d'autres pays où il y a le syndrome, le variant Omicron est là. Les vols ne sont pas interdits. Déjà, il y a 2 poids, 2 mesures. Et oui, s'il faut aller chercher ces gens-là pour qu'ils puissent venir ici, puis aller à l'hôtel, puis avoir une quarantaine qui est bien faite, qui est respectueuse, c'est peut-être la bonne chose à faire pour éviter que ces gens-là soient coincés là-bas. Là.
Est-ce que c'est acceptable que les tests que M. Trudeau a annoncés depuis une semaine maintenant ne sont toujours pas en place dans les aéroports? Les aéroports cherchent l'information encore aujourd'hui?
Bien, c'est faire des annonces, mais pas mettre les ressources sur le terrain, pas être capable de fournir les équipements. Ça me fait penser aux mêmes erreurs qui ont été faites au début de la pandémie, ou quand il a fallu que la Ville de Montréal envoie des fonctionnaires à l'aéroport Trudeau pour donner des informations aux gens, parce que le fédéral était aux abonnés absents. 2 ans plus tard, ils n'ont rien appris.
Juste un autre sujet, M. Boulris, par rapport à ce qui se passe en Ukraine, il y a le sommet Biden-Poutine aujourd'hui. Selon vous, qu'est-ce que le Canada pourrait ou devrait faire dans ce contexte-là qui est très tendu avec les troupes qui sont placées à la frontière?
Bien, je pense que le Canada est une voix forte de la diplomatie internationale, faire respecter la souveraineté du peuple ukrainien. Ça a déjà été brimé dans le passé avec ce qu'on connaît, les incursions russes. On veut une résolution qui est pacifique. On veut le respect des droits de la personne. Je pense que le Canada doit être la voix de la raison, d'être raisonnable, puis d'exercer des pressions diplomatiques ou économiques au besoin. On veut surtout réduire les tensions.
Il y a des pressions qui sont faites sur le Canada pour qu'on envoie davantage de troupes. Qu'est-ce que ça pourrait avoir comme effet, selon vous?
Il va falloir en discuter puis voir avec nos alliés de la communauté internationale. Mais disons que le premier réflexe que j'aurais, c'est d'amener plus de soldats puis plus d'armes sur le terrain. Ça a plus de chances de créer une situation explosive que de ralentir les ardeurs de tout le monde. Merci. Bon intérêt des questions. Thanks.
Oui, bonjour. Ça fait un petit bout que je vous ai vu. Moi aussi. Écoutez, la semaine dernière, vous vous rappellerez que j'avais salué la proactivité du gouvernement. Bien, finalement, ce qu'on se rend compte aujourd'hui, c'est qu'il a été juste rapide à cafouiller. Et ce qu'on veut, nous, au Bloc québécois, c'est des règles claires, uniformes, et que les gens peuvent comprendre puis qui sont capables d'appliquer. Un mauvais règlement, une mauvaise loi, c'est une loi inapplicable. Actuellement, on est dans une situation où, effectivement, c'est à géométrie variable. Donc, tout le monde qui doit embarquer dans l'avion devrait être doublement vacciné et avoir un test négatif 72 heures avant. Ça me semble que c'est clair et à ce moment-là, toutes les péripéties autour d'un test dans certains endroits en 24 heures, les résultats n'arrivent pas. obligé de faire un deuxième test, un troisième test. Il y a même en fin de semaine une dame qui disait avoir fait plus de 5-7 tests. Ça coûte de l'argent pour les gens, donc c'est ce qu'on veut, nous autres, au Bloc québécois. En français, s'il vous plaît.
Qu'est-ce qui se passe avec une personne qui est dans un des 10 pays d'Afrique dont les vols sont interdits? Je vais parler un peu plus fort. Qu'est-ce qui se passe avec les personnes qui sont dans 10 pays d'Afrique qui ne peuvent pas revenir présentement? Les vols ont été annulés. Les vols vers l'extérieur d'autres pays ont aussi été annulés. Est-ce qu'il faudrait les rapatrier? Comment est-ce qu'on devrait dealer avec ces gens?
Là encore, on voit que la situation n'était pas sous contrôle. Une bonne idée, mais dont on ne contrôle pas les tenants et les aboutissants. Le problème actuellement qu'on ne contrôle pas, c'est si vous venez des 10 pays en question, vous devez faire un test dans un pays tiers. Mais on n'a pas, à ce moment-là, assuré la réaction du pays tiers si, par exemple, le virus se met à être encore plus contagieux ou la situation se dégrade. Alors, moi, ce que j'ai dit la semaine dernière, c'est que ce serait intéressant, effectivement, que le gouvernement puisse ne pas laisser les gens à eux-mêmes et qu'ils puissent offrir davantage de soutien dans ces pays-là.
Quel genre de soutien?
Mais par exemple,
on a dit au monde, vous voyagez à vos risques et périls.
Mais il y a des...
On sait qu'il y a une pandémie mondiale.
Non, mais il y a quand même des... Oui, ça va. Mais il y a quand même des gens qui sont pas là pour seulement des voyages d'agrément. Il y a des gens qui étaient en mission. Il y a des gens qui vont supporter pour des missions humanitaires là-bas. Il y a des gens qui étaient là bien avant que le gouvernement décide de mettre en place sa mesure. Et au moins pour ces gens-là, il me semble qu'on devrait les aider sur le terrain avec les ressources que le Canada a dans ces pays.
Moi, ce que je comprenais, c'était que le fouillis est essentiellement sur les tests à l'arrivée, que tous les aéroports sont pas en train. Vous,
Aussi.
Est-ce que c'est ça qui vous préoccupe ou c'est quoi exactement qui vous préoccupe?
On m'a posé la question sur qu'est-ce qu'on devrait faire. Est-ce qu'on devrait ajouter davantage de soutien pour les personnes?
Non, ça, j'ai compris ça, mais je veux dire, plus largement que ça, est-ce que la façon dont on est en train d'appliquer la nouvelle règle qui est des tests à l'arrivée, puis on l'applique de façon plus ou moins égale, est-ce que ça
Le problème, c'est qu'il n'y a pas d'uniformité dans l'application de la règle, d'une part. D'autre part, c'est pas réaliste de demander des tests 24 heures à l'avance quand, dans certains endroits, ils ne sont pas capables de fournir les résultats. Donc, ce qu'on demande, nous, je le répète, c'est que tous les gens, effectivement, sont doublement vaccinés en embarquant dans l'avion et pour passer la frontière ici, doivent avoir un test valide 72 heures à l'avance. C'est ce qu'on demande.
À l'arrivée, est-ce que vous êtes contre l'idée des tests à l'arrivée, le nouveau test à l'arrivée qu'on veut imposer à tout le monde? Vous êtes contre ça?
Parce que dans le processus, il y a des tests
oui, je comprends qu'il y a des tests à l'avance,
après. Ouais. Je veux dire, quelqu'un qui arrive doit aussi repartir chez lui. Et puis, on peut lui fournir des tests. Là. Donc, nous, il n'y a pas de problème à ce niveau-là. Il n'y a pas de problème à ce niveau-là, mais encore faut-il qu'on soit capable de les offrir. Alors là, c'est à géométrie variable. Il y a des aéroports qui ne sont pas capables de recevoir les gens. Donc, ramenons les choses à leur plus simple expression, parce que là, c'est le cafouillis total. Oui?
S'il y a confusion, est-ce que c'est à cause du gouvernement ou c'est à cause des voyageurs qui n'ont pas surveillé leurs affaires avant?
Non, moi, je pense que quand on met en place des nouvelles règles, puis qu'on agit rapidement, on doit d'abord et avant tout s'assurer qu'on a la logistique nécessaire pour pouvoir gérer la règle qu'on met de l'avant.
Les hôtels, vous pensez quoi? Vous connaissez l'autre qui devrait...
Là encore, je pense que c'est une belle preuve encore de l'improvisation. On dit vous allez aller dans des quarantaines, mais on ne contrôle pas encore la mise en place de la règle. Alors, il faut vraiment rectifier ça le plus rapidement possible.
Ça nous prend des vols nolisés ou pas pour ramener les Canadiens?
De là à dire qu'il faut qu'ils soient nolisés, c'est une chose. Moi, je dis il y a moyen d'orienter les gens vers des vols, puis de leur donner de l'aide, qu'il y ait quelqu'un au bout de la ligne qui réponde, qu'on ne soit pas juste pris avec des applications pour pouvoir se dépanner. En fait, il y a des représentants du gouvernement du Canada dans divers pays, là. Alors, il me semble qu'ils devraient être proactifs pour faire en sorte que la règle puisse s'appliquer davantage puis avoir du support au retour. Donc, si dans certains cas, ça prend un vol, puis que ça peut faire en sorte que on facilite les choses, parce que dans le temps de Noël, là, l'appareil va être en veilleuse, là. Les gens vont être en train de fêter. Qui va assurer le soutien? Alors, le gouvernement doit assurer ce soutien-là aussi pendant le temps des fêtes. On est à 2 semaines du temps des fêtes, là. On n'est pas contre. On n'est pas contre si nécessaire. Ça va? Merci.
Merci.
So we agree in principle with the accountability and asking questions around what happened, because there are serious concerns that were raised by armed forces for a long time. And we knew about the evacuation. Despite that, a lot of our allies, a lot of people that put their lives on the line for Canadians were not able to be evacuated from a crisis situation. So there's legitimate questions. We support it in principle. We're still figuring out the details of the motion and whether we'll support the motion, but we agree in principle.
Is there anything in particular that troubles you about the motion?
At this point, we agree again with in principle. We're going to take a close look at the motion, and then we'll assess if we can support it.
So you're concerned with the speed or lack of speed in terms of Canada bringing Afghan refugees to this country?
Is there a concern with the speed? Is that?
Yeah, I'm asking if you're concerned.
Yeah. There's a concern with the speed. There's a concern with the lack of reaction to the concerns raised by Canadian Armed Forces, people on the ground saying that the process was complex. It wasn't in line with what was going on the ground. They were requiring internet access and applications that were not feasible for people to do in the time frame and in the limited resources that people had. It just was not at all appropriate. And a lot of these concerns were raised well in advance. And despite being raised with the Canadian government and the Canadian Armed Forces, nothing was done. And that's really why we agree in principle with evaluating what went wrong, why wasn't this advice heeded, and why were so many allies left behind.
Mr. Singh, just very briefly on...
En français. Donc, on appuie les principes de la motion des conservateurs pour évaluer notre réponse à la crise en Afghanistan, parce que les anciens combattants, les anciens personnels dans nos forces canadiennes ont soulevé des inquiétudes que l'approche du gouvernement n'a pas fonctionné, ne peut pas fonctionner, et malgré le fait qu'ils ont avisé le gouvernement n'a pas agi, n'a pas changé l'approche, et on est dans une situation où plusieurs de nos alliés étaient laissés de côté en Afghanistan dans une situation de péril. Donc, on appuie l'idée d'évaluer comment ça se fait, comment c'est passé comme ça. Et on va évaluer la motion pour décider si on va appuyer la motion directement ou non.
Mr. Singh, on travel bans or on travel rules, the government has been criticized for its requirement for third country testing from the 10 countries in Africa in which only citizens are allowed to return to Canada. Does the NDP support having this third country testing requirement? For example, the UK, the US don't require it. The WHO has criticized it. What's your perspective on it?
We think the best approach is what experts have said is testing on arrival in Canada and a good quarantining system. That's what experts are saying is the most effective way to keep Canadians safe. We agree, and our big concern is that there's been ongoing criticisms of this government not having an effective quarantining mechanism, unclear guidelines around what people can and can't do. Right now, Canadian travelers are still uncertain about what they can do and how they can return to Canada. It's been very unclear, and that's meant an ineffective response to a very serious crisis that we're in.
And the government now says that its rules for on-arrival testing and isolation pending the test results are, quote, coming soon. It was announced November 30th, so a week and a half ago. What does coming soon mean to you about whether the government is actually ready to implement this rule? And is that kind of guidance and information appropriate for travelers?
It's not at all appropriate. That type of timeline, that type of coming soon when we're in the midst of a crisis, we need an immediate reaction. We've got a variant that we want to slow down. And again, this is just to slow down the variant so it buys us time. It is not at all helpful to have a delayed response to dealing with an emergent variant. And then again, the ongoing lack of clarity, the ineffective quarantining, the complaints raised about the quarantine hotels all of these things need to be solved. Other countries have done it right and have been effective and have not had the same levels of complaints that we've seen from the Canadian approach. The Liberal government really needs to step up and make sure they do what's right.
Mr. Singh, earlier the Minister
one.
said that the conditions that we're seeing in some of these quarantine hotels and some of the chaos just generally at the borders is unacceptable. Now, again, this is a week and a half later. Why are we at this point, do you think, and, what should be done to make it better, to make it acceptable?
I just can't imagine why, we are a G7 nation, we've got resources, we've got technology, we've got the capacity and the know-how. I can't understand why this Liberal government hasn't been able to get this right. There are other countries around the world. We've seen New Zealand, Australia, other countries have put in place effective quarantining and it's worked. So there's no excuse for why Canada hasn't been able to do it. There's no excuse for why the Liberal government continues to fail to have an adequate quarantine system. So there's no excuse, and so far the response has been inadequate. Thanks a lot. Merci. Thank you. Thanks.
So can you tell me if the decision has been made yet about a diplomatic boycott against the Olympic Games?
Well, of course, I share the concerns of many regarding what's going on and the allegations of human rights violations in Xinjiang in China. So we've been in contact with many of our like-minded countries and partners and allies on this very question. And of course, we want to make sure that our athletes are able to participate in the next Winter Olympic Games. They've worked so hard. It is important for them to be able to do so. And meanwhile, we're still having the conversations that are required in the circumstances.
And is a diplomatic boycott going to be enough to actually show China how concerned you are about the human rights abuses?
Well, we've raised this issue before the UN. I've raised it with many other like-minded countries. I've talked about it with my counterpart from the U.S., Secretary Blinken, many times, but also with the U.K., Liz Truss, Australia, etc. And of course, it is important that we have this open conversation because we know, as a country and as part of our foreign affairs policy, it's always been clear that we're there to defend human rights in the world.
Si vous faites comme ça un boycott diplomatique?
Je suis pas présentement dans le développement d'hypothèses, mais ce que je peux vous dire, par contre, c'est qu'on est très préoccupés. On a des conversations présentement avec plusieurs pays alliés sur la question. Il va de soi que c'est important qu'on ait cette conversation-là parce que, de façon générale, comme pays, on doit agir en coalition. Et on est contre toute forme de coercition économique. On doit agir en groupe. Et c'est pourquoi j'ai eu tant de conversations avec mes collègues.
Agir en groupe avec les États-Unis, c'était pas suffisant. C'est quand même un des pays les plus puissants de la planète, mais ils ont annoncé leurs intentions.
Les États-Unis ont en effet annoncé leurs intentions. On a eu l'information hier. Entre-temps, on a plusieurs conversations avec plusieurs autres pays, incluant bien entendu les États-Unis.
Have you spoken to any of Canada's allies about potentially speeding up the process of getting Afghan refugees from Afghanistan or other countries getting to Canada?
This is a question that many foreign affairs ministers are asking themselves in the world right now, because the issue of safe passage in Afghanistan is key to be able to bring back Afghan refugees. And so obviously this is something that I raise with my colleagues. I just came back from NATO, just came back from the OSCE, and it is important to be able to work with many of these countries. But I must say, and I must make sure that Canadians are aware that we're one of the countries that has been able to bring the most Afghan refugees in the world. Because obviously we've been partnering with many countries, but also because part of NATO was also because NATO was able to bring some of its Afghan refugees to an important military base. And we've been receiving many of these Afghan NATO-related refugees since then. And while the alliance has dozens and dozens of members, part of it, and Canada is taking the most Afghan NATO-related refugees. Because you know what is important to all remember is Canadians are clear in their intent of receiving Afghan refugees. And we can be extremely proud of that because we know that immigration and diversity is our strength.
Just with the Syrian refugees, it happened very fast.
Yes.
In a period of months. So what's taking so long with the Afghan refugees?
At the time, during the Syrian refugee crisis, the UN was present in many countries, including Turkey, including Jordan, including Lebanon, and we were partnering as a country with the UN to make sure that we could get these Afghan refugees, Syrian refugees, I'm sorry. At this point, the UN is not there in Afghanistan yet, nor in neighboring countries, which creates much more difficulties to bring Afghan refugees.
And when can we expect a decision on the diplomatic boycott?
In due course. Thank you.
Could I just ask you on the Afghan refugees, 40,000 people, why, obviously a big operation, why is it taking so long to get these many Afghans over the country?
Well, look, let me start by saying that today is actually a pretty good news day. I don't know if you were paying attention to question period. I was able to share that we expect by the end of this week there's going to be another 520 vulnerable Afghan refugees that land in Canada. This is in addition to the hundreds who landed last week, in addition to the thousands that were already here. One of the things that I think is really important to focus on is that when you're trying to move 40,000 people out of one of the most challenging environments imaginable, one of the most dangerous places in the world today, it's not easy. We need to deal with the situation in Afghanistan, which is under the control of the Taliban. We need to deal with the fact that there is limited referral capacity with our partners in the surrounding region for people who are already outside of Afghanistan. But when I look at the work that's been going in, both with the public service and in the Minister's office, I see people who are working every day and every night to get people here as quickly as possible. And I think today, with the sharing the news that there's going to be more people arriving this week, you can see a pattern that people are starting to arrive with some regularity, and it's something that gives me great hope.
You were asking her a number of times. I was paying attention.
Yeah, as you usually do, yeah.
But you were asking her a number of times, how long is this going to take? So how long is this going to take to get 40,000 people in?
Yeah, well, look, I don't have an announcement on the official date that we expect the 40,000th person to arrive today. What I'm really encouraged by is that we're starting to see a regular pace of arrivals. We need to manage not just the situation that I described overseas, but also making sure that people have support of the settlement services that they have locally. So it's going to be depending on a number of factors, including whether we can process people in the area, have them referred to us to qualify as refugees, but also making sure that we have the support so they succeed when they get here. It's going to be a combination of the government-assisted refugee program and private sponsorship, which we're starting to see with some of these newer arrivals. And as soon as we sort of have firm information that we can communicate on the pacing of the arrivals month to month going forward, of course, we're going to communicate that as transparently as possible.
And what conversations are you having with other countries about ensuring? I mean, we're hearing that some countries are starting to send people back. So, like, what conversations are you having with those countries to make sure that the people who are supposed to get to Canada are going to get?
So there are no shortage of conversations going on this very specific point, and I'd point out that countries in the world that are parties to the Refugee Convention are subject to the requirement of non-refoulement. They're not allowed in international law to send people back. Of course, it's something that we watch very closely when we're trying to assess the vulnerability of different groups. The specific group that we're talking about, it would depend on the circumstances that they're facing, the country that they may be in now. I was in Guatemala last week for a migration conference focused on Central Americas because Canada's assumed the chair role of the support platform for that group. But we also had the opportunity to have bilateral meeting with countries who are facilitating things in Afghanistan and the surrounding region. For example, a meeting with the United States where we discussed how we can partner in the region. A meeting with the High Commissioner, UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to discuss how they can potentially ramp up in an expeditious way their ability to refer more people for the spaces that we've already made available to them. In the region, we're having conversations, and I'm stepping on the toes of my colleagues at Global Affairs a little bit, with Pakistan, with the UAE, with Qatar, and of course with the Americans who have an arrangement with Qatar to manage their affairs in Afghanistan. So there's no shortage of these conversations. Whenever we think that there's a partner organization or state that we can work with to help secure the safe passage of people out of Afghanistan, the referral of people who might qualify for refugee status that would be accepted to Canada, we're making those calls every day.
I asked the Minister Justin, so I'll just put the question to you as well. With Syrian refugees, it happened fast and very quickly. What's the difference? Why was it so more quick to get 25,000 Syrian refugees here than it is to get 40,000 Afghan refugees here?
So this is a really important question. I think Canadians watched with a source of national pride the speed with which we were able to get people from Syria to Canada living in our communities. Look, this is a big deal to me at home. The very first Syrian refugee that landed in my home province of Nova Scotia has become a dear friend of mine, Tara Haddad, who of course is famous for the Peace by Chocolate success story. And people at home watch that sort of success story repeated in small businesses with the goodwill of refugees who are making a contribution to their community with enormous pride. But we cannot compare the situation in Syria to what we're dealing with in Afghanistan. It is not close. In Syria, we were dealing with a centrally managed organization and effort run by the UNHCR. There was a pool of tens of thousands of people that have now come to Canada, hundreds of thousands or more when you look total what have been resettled across the world today. We were dealing with access to an airstrip that was managed by people who knew how to move people. We were dealing with not just the UNHCR's physical capacity to have people there, but to refer them in a way that we could trust met our security and refugee criteria. When we're dealing with Afghanistan, the situation could not be more different. We don't have a presence in Afghanistan today. The Taliban, a terrorist entity under Canadian law, has seized control of the region. They are not in a mood to help the government of Canada, and if they were, they wouldn't be very good at it. They don't know how to manage logistics. They don't know how to run airports. We do not have capacity with referral partners in the region. Every step of the way, there are obstacles facing us in Afghanistan that were not present in Syria. If this was a matter of political will, there would be 40,000 Afghan refugees here tomorrow. It's a matter of logistics, it's a matter of relationships, and it's a matter of resettlement. These are things that we are working on literally every hour of every day, and the effort, there's no lack of effort on the part of the Government of Canada. It's the situational factors that we're dealing with that we will overcome, but it's simply not as simple as things were in Syria, despite the fact that there were challenges there as well.
Minister, I just have a quick question. When you mentioned here from your writing, there were a lot of reports after the Syrian refugees were resettled that people who were privately sponsored were a lot more successful than refugees who were government sponsored. So what are you going to do to ensure that when it comes to these Afghan refugees that you don't see that same divide?
So look, there's some truth to that, to be honest. When people arrive through the private sponsorship streams, there's no question that they arrive with a community group who's helping set bank accounts up, telling them how to use public transit, often paired with people who can help teach them the language. The government-assisted refugee stream comes with different advantages. We can move people quickly, and we can target people based on their vulnerability. We don't set out on a mission to resettle refugees based purely on how well they're going to do when we get here. The reason that we pursue the resettlement of refugees is to do the right thing from a moral perspective and help the world's most vulnerable people get to a place where they are safe and no longer at risk of violence, persecution, or death. With the government-assisted refugee streams, we're able to target groups that are particularly vulnerable. I'm thinking of the LGBTQI+ community. There's no guarantee when you're dealing with private sponsorship that you're going to get those people who are facing particular threats. There'd be no guarantee with private sponsorship, although I'm sure there would be some, that we're able to help those who've helped Canada during our time of need in Afghanistan. So the two programs need to operate in parallel, both to improve the chances of success when people land here and resettle in our communities, but also to get people here as quickly as possible who may not otherwise get there despite the fact they may be more vulnerable. And I'd point out that the majority of the now nearly 5,000 people who are in Canada today have actually come through the government-assisted refugee stream. And when we're dealing with shifting landscape on the ground in a place like Afghanistan today that again has been seized by the Taliban, getting people out as quickly as possible was something that was really important in those early days.
And how are people doing right now? I know a couple of weeks ago there were some public reports about some hotels that were not, just one hotel that was not up to standard, and then those people were resettled into a different hotel in Toronto. Are there still a number of these refugees that are still in hotels, or have they mostly been placed in communities?
Well, I think you can appreciate as people are still arriving sort of days ago and in the days ahead, there's going to be some temporary shelter solutions that are going to have to be a part of this effort, really until the end of the effort, until we have everyone resettled successfully in Canada. But the truth of the success of their resettlement will be written years from now. When we know if people are adjusting to their new community, have learned one of Canada's official languages, have jobs that allow them to support themselves, that's when we'll know if the resettlement effort has been a success. I anticipate on a person-to-person basis, the rate of success will vary immensely. That's human nature. But what's important right now is we've not taken our eyes off the focus, which is to get people here as quickly as possible and to make sure that we make good on the commitment to help those who've helped us, and also make sure to make good on the commitment to resettle 40,000 Afghan refugees in Canada.
Anyone else? Okay, thanks so much, everyone. Appreciate it.
Ms. Bergen, the Liberals say the Tory approach with mandatory minimums didn't work. What's your reaction to the new bill?
Well, it's interesting that the first criminals are going to go after in order to protect our criminals who are committing crimes with guns. This has been our argument the entire time, I mean, since I was elected. If you want to fight gun crime, you go after the people who are committing crimes with guns. And I think the message that this is sending, I haven't had a good look at the legislation, but the message that this is sending is, of course, in line with what Liberals do, go after law-abiding firearms owners and let the criminals off the hook. So I don't like it. I think it's bad legislation from what I've heard of it, but we'll take a look at it and have further comment later.
I mean, the government says, we just heard in the House of Commons when they asked themselves a question, you know, the former medical health officer of the Yukon cited that they need to decriminalize, that they need to provide safe supply, that they need to invest more in housing and wraparound supports for, you know, the biggest health crisis outside of COVID that we've seen in generations. And the government's response is C5, removing, you know, mandatory sentences. You know, this is so ridiculous. People are dying on the streets of our country, and this is what they come back with? I mean, I called for an emergency debate in the House this morning, which I'm disappointed didn't get approved. But we haven't had a good discussion in the House of Commons around a deadly poison drug supply that's taking the daughters and sons away, stealing them from their families in our country and in my community. And, you know, the government needs to take action. They can't be criminalizing people on a health issue. You know, the Prime Minister keeps saying that the overdose crisis is a health issue, yet it's, he's still criminalizing people. You know, the stigma that we know is part of the whole problem starts with the Prime Minister. He's failing to act. So I'm hoping that the government will actually take real action. Time's running out. There's over 20 people a day dying. You know, Vancouver's put in a request for an exemption. BC, Vancouver's request was months ago. Now, you know, we heard Toronto's Board of Health yesterday decide that they're going to move forward with requesting an exemption. Last Monday, the Yukon cited that 20%, their coroner cited that 20% of the deaths are from an overdose. We heard in Saskatchewan, they've had 132%, Ontario, 132% rise of deaths from Indigenous people from overdoses. You know, this toxic drug supply and the spike in overdose and the lack of inaction is absolutely unacceptable. And, you know, where's the action? Where's the response from the government? Why is there no public health emergency been declared? Because of the stigma.
And on the mandatory minimums, though, the government's saying that it impacted disproportionately a number of Black and Indigenous Canadians. Do you think that this will help that situation?
Well, it's a small step, but really, they should be, you know, decriminalizing. You know, they say that it's a health issue, then why are they still criminalizing people? The barriers that it creates for people is unbelievable, and the shame that's attached to it. You know, if they truly wanted to do something, they'd, you know, expunge all records, make it free and do it quickly, so that people, you know, don't have to carry that burden with them. You know, the Prime Minister keeps saying that he listens to health officials when it comes to the COVID crisis. You know, I appreciate that, but, you know, when it comes to the drug overdose crisis, the same health officials are citing that the government needs to decriminalize. They need to provide a safe supply. Why isn't he listening to them? Because of the stigma, and it starts with him. He needs to take action. And people, the families, the mothers and fathers aren't getting the answers. The Mom Stop the Harm, the Canadian Mental Health Association, medical professionals from right across the country have been calling for this. And the Police Chiefs Association, what's he waiting for?
Thank you.
Yeah, you bet.